heard of in prosecutorial circles. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, Brian, usually when we have a witness we want to put before the grand jury, and the witness has privileges that they want to try to invoke to keep from having to testify before the grand jury, we put them in the grand jury, they testify, and it's a very long, drawn-out process. Jack Smith just turned that on its head. He said, we're not going to go through all that. We're not going to wait. We're not going to drag this out. And he filed a preemptory motion with the Chief Judge Beryl Howell, who has supervisory responsibility over the grand jury. And he said that he wants Judge Beryl Howell to rule up front that Mike Pence has no privileges. Now, this would be like if Jack Smith was a Major League Baseball pitcher and he was striking people out while they were still sitting in the dugout. I mean, before they came out, approached the plate for their at-bat. This is not the way it's ordinarily done, and it tends to show that Jack Smith is going 100 miles an hour in some really unorthodox ways in the direction of justice.
Now, is there any legal benefit to Pence not testifying? Now, I know there's a political benefit to him not testifying because anything that he does to go up, against Trump could be viewed as politically damaging to him since he's still trying to pander to a crowd that wants him hanged. But is there any legal benefit here for him to go forward and try not to comply with this subpoena?
The answer is there really is no legal benefit. Now, here's the only thing I can tease out if I looked at this as an academic exercise. So if Mike Pence goes into the grand jury and he doesn't try to invoke any privilege, instead he just fully, truthfully, and accurately testifies about the crimes of Donald Trump, crimes that he inarguably knows Donald Trump committed because Trump was pressuring him relentlessly to violate the law, to obstruct the official congressional proceedings of certifying Joe Biden's win. So if Mike Pence just decided to go in the grand jury and forego all possible privileges, executive privilege, this sort of new harebrained scheme that he has to try to claim he's a legislator and invoke speech or debate clause privilege, if he did that and it turned out he was wrong, well, then he would have violated privileges, and that could come back to haunt him legally. But as I say, Brian, that's more of an academic exercise because I don't think Mike Pence has any viable privileges to invoke.
So is this kind of thing where he's going to go in and he doesn't want to give an extra inch because if he gives an extra inch voluntarily without being obligated to do so by the judge, then anything he gives voluntarily, Trump can turn around and basically, jump down his throat for having done that?
He can, but think about this. Let's assume Mike Pence runs this to ground and he invokes every privilege known to man to try to keep from the grand jury incriminating information about Donald Trump, and he loses all of those privilege battles, and the judge orders him to testify, and then, reluctantly, he tells the grand jury about Donald Trump's crimes. Donald Trump is still going to jump down his throat.
Right.
And I don't think anything Mike Pence can do will curry favor with Donald Trump's base, because let's face it, they were the ones who wanted to hang him on January 6th. I can't imagine he's going to rebuild a bridge back to those people.
Well, I don't know. There might be some constituency for Mike Pence within the Hang Mike Pence party, so that remains to be seen. Glenn, do you see a world in which Pence is able to win out here and basically shield himself from testifying, by leaning on this whole president of the Senate, I'm a legislator now theory?
No, it's actually an interesting issue that he has raised, but it's sort of been addressed by the Supreme Court over the last 4 or 5 decades. Here's what he's trying to claim. He's trying to claim that because actual legislators, senators and representatives, have what's called speech or debate clause privileges and immunities. And what that means is if legislators are talking about legislation, we don't want them to be dragged in court to have to testify about it. We want them to have this sort of full, unfettered opportunity to robustly debate legislation.
Yeah.
That is what the speech or debate clause privilege is. Mike Pence says, well, because I am the president of the Senate on January 6th, and I have the ceremonial duty of opening the envelopes and counting the electoral college votes. Of course, we already know what the tally will be. Therefore, I should have speech or debate clause privilege too, because I am a member of the Senate. I'm a legislator at that moment. To which I say, no, you're not, because the Supreme Court case law talks about how, if you're going to be covered, if your activity is going to enjoy speech or debate clause privileges and immunities, you basically have to be involved in what the Supreme Court refers to as a legislative sphere of activity. And that is not what Mike Pence is doing on January 6th. And here's the other thing. You know, we can look elsewhere to figure out how the courts might resolve this issue. Remember how Lindsey Graham desperately didn't want to testify before the Georgia State grand jury, so he tried to pull out the speech or debate clause card. And every single judge, up to and including the Supreme Court, shot him down and said, no, you have to go in there and testify. And if there's one question or two questions that might implicate your speech and debate clause privilege, you can invoke it at that time. But they even ordered an actual senator, an actual legislator, to go in and testify, even though he is somebody that does have speech or debate clause immunity. So this dog will not hunt for Mike Pence.
Yeah, especially like in his role, in his perfunctory role as just trying to say the preordained number of votes that we already know he had to say. So, Glenn, the fact that Jack Smith is going full steam ahead here, going full scorched earth on this, is there anything that you can glean from that as far as his broader case is concerned?
You know, what I can glean is not so much about the evidence he has or the direction in which he's heading in his investigation, but what it does tell me, Brian, is that Jack Smith is a different kind of federal prosecutor. And I say this with no disrespect to my friends, my former colleagues, the federal prosecutors I worked with for decades. They're a pretty conservative bunch. They do not go scorched earth in their investigations, particularly, and I hate to say it, but this is my lived experience. When it comes to investigating the crimes of the ruling class criminals, the rich, the powerful, the influential, the connected, the political, boy, DOJ tends to sit back on its heels, do the ultra-conservative thing, and take its time. Jack Smith is doing the opposite. He is going 100 miles an hour in the direction of holding the ruling class criminals accountable. And I know we've been waiting for justice for a very long time, but given everything I see out of Jack Smith, I'm starting to feel like maybe there's a little bit of justice kind of peeking out over the horizon.
Yeah, it's a nice change of pace, too, from the pace that Merrick Garland has given, which is to give as much latitude in the world and kind of, basically what strikes me about all of this is that Merrick Garland had exponentially more time than Jack Smith has right now, and yet in the short amount of time that Jack Smith's been here, the fact that he's been able to push forward with all of these things that ostensibly should have happened under Merrick Garland kind of just goes to show that a lot of that time wasn't even used when Merrick Garland should have been moving forward on this stuff and subpoenaing these legislators like Lindsey Graham, subpoenaing Jack Smith, subpoenaing Mike Pence and Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner and on and on. The fact that it didn't happen, but that it took Jack Smith several years into this investigation, but only 3 years into his tenure, kind of goes to show the difference between these two prosecutors.
Yeah, when you realize that Jack Smith was only appointed as special counsel on November 18th, 3 months ago, and look at just some of what he's done that, I'm sorry to say, Merrick Garland and company failed or neglected to do, from subpoenaing a former vice president to subpoenaing a former chief of staff to the president of the United States to subpoenaing a White House counsel and a deputy White House counsel and the president's daughter and the president's son-in-law and the president's criminal defense attorneys, which I'm telling you, that's another sort of, a 9 on the legal Richter scale, because usually we do not subpoena the criminal defense attorneys representing the target of our criminal probe, the person we're intending to indict. For obvious reasons, they would have an attorney-client privilege. Jack Smith is going 100 miles an hour, as I say, in the direction of accountability.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy when you say that out loud, to hear how many people were left untapped in all of that time is kind of, it reeks of malpractice. But in any case, I do want to switch gears a little bit here and talk for just a moment on Fulton County, Georgia. There's criticism from the right being levied at the jury's forewoman. So where is that criticism coming from, and do you think that it's warranted?
I think primarily it's coming from, Team Trump, the flunkies and the hangers on. And, they're pulling out the fainting couch and they're saying, oh my goodness, I can't believe this forewoman of the grand jury is talking openly, giving interviews about what happened in a grand jury proceeding. Well, guess what? Georgia has its own rules governing what grand jurors can and cannot do, what they can and cannot say. And under the rules and the laws in Georgia, members of the grand jury are permitted to talk about what happened in the grand jury, including giving media interviews. Brian, I was so heartened that Judge McBurney down in Georgia, who is the judge who had supervisory responsibility over the Georgia Special Grand Jury, gave an interview to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and he cleared all this up. In a very real sense, he had the back of the jury forewoman, a 30-year-old young woman named Emily Kors. And he said, wait a minute. Grand jurors in Georgia are permitted to talk about anything that happened in the grand jury except their deliberations. And he made it clear. He said, when witnesses are in the grand jury, when district attorneys are in the grand jury, the grand jurors are permitted to talk about what they saw and what they heard. The only thing they can't say, they can't talk about, is their private deliberations when they're alone in the grand jury together and they're reviewing the evidence and they're trying to decide who to indict. That's the only prohibition. They can talk about everything else. In fact, Judge McBurney made it clear in the interview he gave that Emily Kors could have disclosed more than she disclosed.
So all of
these
there?
folks were saying, oh my
This
goodness,
ain't pretty
she
calm
blew
here.
up any possibility that Trump will be
I'm just
successfully
putting up some
prosecuted, because now
highlights,
there are all kinds of legal
what's
challenges
going
that can
on
be
in
lodged against the
Congress
indictment
and
and against the process.
surrounding
That is pure
investigations
nonsense. It's
of Donald
propaganda,
Trump and all the
it's
bullshit
disinformation,
he's
and it is
in.
nothing more than
And I
PR
really want
garbage.
to
It
do
will have
the
absolutely no
CPAC thing.
legal
It was so
impact on the
ridiculous.
proceedings.
I don't
And
think
it's always so funny to
I
see
get
just
sick
how
every time I
sensitive
hear
the
him,
Trump
but
team is to the
these are
tiniest
some
little things
crazy
that are
people right
legal,
now.
and yet don't seem to think that Donald Trump inciting an insurrection on January 6th was a problem. Don't seem to think that Trump taking hundreds of classified documents and unlawfully retaining them was a problem. Don't seem to think that him extorting a foreign leader for dirt on Joe Biden was a problem. The things that they think are just the end of the world, pull out the fainting couches, clutch your pearls, are like versus the things that are actual federal crimes. I mean, it's just pretty crazy the distinction here.
And one of my favorite moments was when a reporter said to Emily Kors, this grand juror, that, did you see that Donald Trump posted something saying that your grand jury report totally exonerated him? And you could see the surprise on her face. And she said, he said that? Oh, that's fantastic. That's just great. I love that. You didn't have to read between the lines to realize that what she was saying, what she was communicating was, you know what? Donald Trump is about to be indicted. And the fact that he would claim we totally exonerated him is just beyond belief. Because some of what she did say in her interview is, we started by focusing on that phone call where Donald Trump told the Georgia Secretary of State, just give me 11,780 votes. And we kind of worked through the evidence from there. And she said, you know what? When you see who we recommended should be indicted, there will be no surprises. It will not come as a shock to you, because this is not rocket science. You know what, Brian? The only thing that would come as a shock to me is if the grand jury didn't recommend Donald Trump should be indicted for his crimes.
Seems like a good place to leave off. So for anybody watching, if you want to keep up on this stuff, make sure to follow both of our channels. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.
Hey, yo. Don't be looking at those bags behind you. I want to show y'all some other things, right? If I can find
not just
them.
to
But how
show
y'all
that
doing?
there's
Happy
on the
Saturday?
side
Or is it
of
Sunday yet?
working class
I
people
don't know
and
what
sort of,
time it is right
you know,
now.
sort of engage in this economic populism,
But
but
these
really
are
like
just
go
some
bigger. And it
podcasts,
is like,
true podcasts that I watch. You know, to get great information. Real information. Not just people. Let's see the CPOP. They're supposed to be
The CPAC that
conservative.
they got going on.
Shit,
Donald
and
Trump
we
is
have some
apparently is he
commentators
going to speak
here.
tomorrow. Is that the? You
I,
might speak. I mean, come
I'm
on,
not
give the
too
same.
real
Oh,
great with
I'm
these
the
commentators,
victim.
but
Yeah, I would.
I'm gonna go to my save category because I look at things and I may not have time to totally look, totally look at the whole thing. So I will save them for you, and I think I'm trying to find them. Okay. So now this person, I love her because this is someone that speaks. Uh, you know, she's pretty much. I think she is. Let's see if I can get her. And she's telling a whole story about Russia and the Ukraine, Russia taking over Ukraine. And so I want to go and I want to
cs.com/politicsgirl
so
for 15%
what
off your first
we're
order.
gonna do
And don't forget to
is
throw in.
we're gonna go back because I watched almost the whole thing, and I thought she's
That mascara.
incredible.
I swear to
I thought she was incredible with explaining things and letting the American people know what
God, it's the
what
best.
really be going on. You know what I'm saying? Because you get so much propaganda and things like that. So we're gonna start with her, and then we're gonna find some other things. Excuse the you know the.
MAGA Republicans are out here with their Russian talking
And let's
points,
listen to
attacking
her,
Ukraine
'cause-
like they have a goddamn clue, and it puts us all in danger. You want to know what's going on over there? Let's talk about what's going on over there.
I like her. You also subscribe to her if you want to have more information.
Hello, and welcome to the Politics Girl podcast. I'm your host, Lee McGowan. Let's get into it. It's been 1 year since the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine under the false pretense of demilitarizing and denazifying the country. On February 24th, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin launched an armed offensive into Ukraine from the north, east, and south, claiming it to be a special military operation to protect ethnic Russians and to keep Ukraine in the sphere of Russian influence. Understandably, Ukraine saw 190,000 Russian soldiers pouring across their borders as an act of war, an illegal act of aggression against a sovereign democratic nation. And with the support and aid of the NATO nations and the European Union, they chose to fight back. We have to remember that this was not something that had to happen. There was no burning conflict between neighboring nations that spilled into war. This was something Russia chose to do. There is no both sides here. Yes, it takes two to tango, but in this case, one dancer was handcuffed to the other against their will. This is not something Ukraine got itself into. This is something Russia forced upon them. The blame for this war, and the human, financial, and geopolitical cost of it, belongs solely on the leadership of the Russian Federation. In fact, right up to the moment before Russian missiles filled Ukrainian skies, before the biggest air, sea, and ground assault in Europe since World War II, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was still appealing to Russia to not invade his country. In the dead of night, before the first soldier crossed his border, he recorded a video plea to Putin, seeking peace and asking for reason to prevail. Like all the NATO leaders and representatives who had spoken to Putin before, he was trying to convince him of another course of action. Zelensky warned Russia that the consequences of his choice would be terrible. He spoke of the abundance of pain, filth, blood, and death that would follow such an action. He explained that the war would be a calamity that would carry a huge cost in every meaning of the word. And yet Russia, but more specifically Russian leadership, could not be swayed. So at the 1 year mark of this unnecessary and tragic war, I thought we should take a moment to talk about it. For the most part, The war in Ukraine is not really on people's radar anymore. It sits somewhere in the periphery. I mean, we know it's going on, but it's not really affecting us. We hear snippets. We're sending more money. This kind of anti-aircraft missile is going over. President Zelensky made a speech to Congress. Russia is making nuclear threats. But honestly, our news feeds are filled with Republican House members' random congressional hearings about things like Twitter and what George Santos is lying about now, or what Marjorie Taylor Greene means when she talks about a national divorce. Some people were even mad that we were talking about the bravery and leadership of President Biden visiting an active war zone in Kyiv for the anniversary of the conflict because he hadn't yet been to Ohio, where a train derailment had happened. Or they believed that federal money should be going to the people of East Palestine rather than Ukraine, not realizing that A, the Ohio governor hasn't asked for any money or aid, and that B, money allotted for disaster cleanups through FEMA is not remotely the same money allotted for national defense and foreign aid. But the general gist I'm hearing is that Ukraine is far away and the war doesn't really affect us. So why should we care? Why are we still sending money? How does sending aid even help us? So I wanted to take a moment to break it down, to tell you why defeating the Russians in Ukraine, as Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said on Fox News, is the single most important event we have going on in the world right now. And that softening on the war or second-guessing our role in helping the Ukrainians achieve victory shouldn't be a thing. As McConnell said, I'm sorry that public opinion is sliding, but I need to assure the American people that this is enormously important, and we must stay together on a bipartisan basis to support these people who are bravely fighting for freedom and democracy. And I rarely agree with Mitch McConnell, so this is a big deal. Despite what you hear from ultra-MAGA representatives complaining about all the money being spent, according to another Republican Senator, Mitt Romney, the spending we're doing on Ukraine is very much in line with any spending we do for national defense. We spend about $750 billion a year protecting America's interest abroad. Now, there's a legitimate debate to be had about that number, if perhaps we could be spending some of that money on the American people or on domestic programs that could help us improve our quality of life. But we're not going to have that debate in the middle of an ongoing war with the very people who vote against that kind of public spending anytime it comes up. The people complaining about the costs of this war are the same ones who vote against cutting medical costs, against universal health care, against climate initiatives, and raising the minimum wage.
Exactly.
What they do consistently vote for is the military-industrial complex and protecting America's national security against foreign adversaries that would threaten us. So Ukraine would fall deeply into that bucket. The argument about money has more to do with sowing unrest among the American people for political gain than any concern about spending. And just to drive that point home, according to Mitch McConnell, the spending on this war so far comes out to be about 0.02% of our GDP. So no matter what mean-spirited, self-serving GOP politicians like Ted Cruz, who just called President Zelensky's battle fatigues a costume and accused the leader of fighting a frontline battle between democracy and autocracy as being engaged in theater on his podcast, the truth is the winner of this war will set the terms for the future of geopolitics, which will deeply affect American security and prosperity. So the naysayers are just wrong. What's being decided now is if we'll be living in a world where one country can simply invade another, destroy their economy and their infrastructure, and commit genocide on their people in flagrant disregard for international law, or if we live in a world where there are actual consequences for this kind of barbarism and horror. Are strong nations simply allowed to take over others without recourse, or does the world order stand against that? Does democracy prevail, or are we looking at a future of autocrats where might means right? As Tim
ADT systems now feature Google products like the Nest Cam with Floodlight, with intelligent alerts when a person...
As Timothy Snyder, professor of history at Yale University and author of The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America says, 100 years from now, historians will be writing about the war in Ukraine. Everything that grabs our attention, or the airwaves right now, gas prices, masks, Hunter Biden's laptop, will have all but disappeared into the mists of time. But whether Ukraine wins or loses this war is something historians are going to be writing about for generations to come. A lot has happened since Russia invaded Ukraine, and we need to be clear that any space that might have been open for Ukrainian public opinion to lean towards concessions to Russia are all but gone. This has been a brutal war, But it's important we remember that this hot war is just the latest phase in a conflict that began in 2014 when the Russian military illegally seized a region in the southeast border of Ukraine called Crimea and took it for themselves. And then they backed a separatist campaign in the Donbass region of Ukraine to claim that for Russia as well. In fact, Russia has been violating Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity for decades, including having the first group of Ukrainian presidents simply be puppet governments for the Kremlin, allowing Russia to rule the country by proxy. It was this Russian control of Ukrainian government and the corrupt elections that led to it that finally caused the Ukrainian people to rise up in revolution and open the door to free and fair elections. And once they were under their own control and listening to the will of their own people, Ukraine started making decisions Russia didn't like becoming closer with Europe or talking about joining NATO. To understand this war, you have to understand that Putin sees Ukraine as part of Russia, at best a satellite state, and losing control of it, especially to a pro-democratic faction that was friendly with the EU, was absolutely unacceptable to him. Experts believe that Putin saw Moscow and Kyiv as one and the same, and it's his belief that the only reason the two capitals aren't one is because outside influences have kept them apart. Timothy Snyder explains that Putin's entire mindset is filtered through a Russian lens. He very rarely leaves Russia. He doesn't speak any other languages. He doesn't even really know that much about Ukraine. But if Ukraine didn't want to be part of Russia, in Putin's mind, that must be because of some kind of foreign conspiracy. In many ways, Putin has been able to bring a lot of the countries that were independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union back under his umbrella, or what he calls the Russian sphere of influence. The only country that seems to have truly evaded his grasp was Ukraine. And Ukraine was essential to him because of its size, its strategic location, and its relationship to Europe and its Western democratic values. As Fiona Hill, former official at the U.S. National Security Council, specializing in Russian and European affairs, puts it, Putin wanted to ensure that Ukraine, like other countries, had no other option than subjugation to Russia. Putin didn't like Ukraine playing footsie with Europe and making democracy look successful right on his border. He'd spent too long working to undermine democracy, to have any real elections and working rule of law right out in the open where people could see it. There were too many people who lived in Ukraine who had family in Russia, and vice versa. Russians could see that Ukrainians could vote. They could see that their voices were heard and their revolutions were successful. They could see a peaceful transfer of power and watch the country drift closer to Europe and European values. And this was outrageous to Putin. America is often put up as Russia's enemy because Russia chooses to make us so. But Russia is also threatened by the European Union because it proves, with the right encouragement, aid, and norms, you can take a flawed post-communist state and make it a prosperous nation. European countries, just like America, show that there is a different way, maybe a better way, and that doesn't work for the Russian Federation. America is Russia's big bad enemy, not because America is actually a threat to Russia, but because America represents democracy, and democracy is a threat to Russian leadership. If Donald Trump did nothing else for Russia, he delivered on the idea that democracy America had been selling was a joke. He proved that rules didn't apply to everyone equally, that politics is fundamentally about rich guys becoming richer and corruption being normal. His outrageous rhetoric, his disrespect for American institutions, his lack of interest in the welfare of the American people, the countless scandals he's embroiled in, did more for Russian propaganda outlets than they could have ever done for themselves.
Yes.
Trump was out on the world stage showing American democracy to be the joke Russia always said it was. That this idea of a free and just society with the rule of law that respected its citizens with things like freedom and justice was just a fallacy. Timothy Snyder believes we've always misunderstood Putin, in that we misunderstood Russia as a failed transition to democracy. Snyder says Russia was never a failed transition to democracy. It was always an alternative to democracy, pretending to be a democracy, but which functioned on foreign policy to undermine real democracies. As Snyder puts it, the Putin regime is not about creating things. It's about removing alternatives and about making the corruption and the inequality and the spectacle and the constant lying seem normal. Whether Russia had goals for the Trump presidency or not, Trump gave them more than they could have ever hoped for. He made Putin's behavior seem normal. And he made American democracy look like Russian democracy, corrupt and lawless. It allowed Russia to be like, see, that's just how countries run. America's no different. Democracy doesn't work. There isn't a better alternative.
Go ahead,
Everyone is
political
corrupt.
girl.
Everyone lies. This whole rule of law thing is bullshit. So you should just take what you can get. No one was happier about January 6th than the Russians. All the things they had been preaching on their propaganda networks about democracy being a joke and peaceful transfers of power not being realistic, we gave them in 4K images. Putin has been sending the message that he was willing to fight back against democracy since 2007, when he made a speech at the National Security Conference calling the West Russia's enemy. If you look back on the speech Putin made before the war in Ukraine, what he still refers to as a special military operation, a fair amount of it is about the United States. Yes, the speech is about liberating Ukraine, but he's also talking about the empire of lies. Snyder points out that it's not that Putin is talking about real America, but the fantasy of America that he sells to his people. An America that wants to steal from them and take things from them and treat them badly. That of course America would do something insidious like try and take Ukraine from Russia. Snyder says the way to understand Putin is to follow the failure of his domestic policy. He came into power in 2000 with the basic idea that Russia could be made into some kind of rule of law state. At the time, Putin used the phrase dictatorship of the law. But when he realized he wasn't going to be able to do it with the oligarchy that was in place, he shifted gears to a different type of rule, one that included the oligarchy, just with himself as the top oligarch. What Snyder calls the boss of bosses. Every 6 years, Russia has elections, and every 6 years, Putin wins, by a lot. Experts say it's not even that people really believe Putin is winning, it's more that every 6 years, he proves to them that he's in charge. This idea that elections could be real, that there are places where leaders can lose and then go away, is a threat to his very existence, and to the way he believes Russia should be run. Putin has chosen a corrupt system. Russians don't get what they want out of their rule of law. Their social mobility and freedom is limited, and they only see and hear what their government allows them to see and hear in the media. And Putin spends an enormous amount of time and resources convincing his people of his chosen narrative. Before Putin ordered his troops into Ukraine, the Kremlin spent years spreading false narratives that would justify his military action. Many Russian soldiers and civilians really believed they were liberating the country from Nazis, that Ukrainians would be happy to be freed, that they were the good guys. Most of the things they read and saw in their country and learned in their schools fed into this narrative. Like their entire country only has a version of Fox News, and they function under that reality. Our Fox News even helped them amplify Kremlin talking points in America. If you have ever heard that Ukraine was utilizing US-funded research labs to develop bioweapons, that was a Russian piece of propaganda placed into the media ecosystem to justify an invasion. Once the war was started, the Russian government blocked all access to Western social media platforms inside the country, even designating Facebook, Meta, as an extremist organization. Prominent Putin critics either left Russia or were arrested. Putin criminalized independent reporting and stripped independent media of their licensing. The government passed a law imposing up to 15 years in prison for the spreading of fake news about the war. Saying the word war became illegal. Prominent radio stations were taken off the air. A newspaper led by a Nobel Peace Prize laureate lost his license. Entertainers who opposed the war quickly lost work as their shows were closed and people refused to hire them. Activists were arrested on charges of spreading false information, and anti-war protesters were detained and beaten or arrested and put in prison. Even people who weren't activists, just civilians publicly horrified by war, now face up to 10 years in jail. Putin created laws that effectively criminalized any public expression against the war. The crackdown was immediate and ruthless and unparalleled in post-Soviet Russia. It's impossible to deny that Putin was able to intimidate a majority of Russian society into silence. And, as you would expect with the purge of critics, it was followed by an influx of propaganda. State TV suspended entertainment programs and expanded political and news programming to boost the narrative that Russia was winning, ridding the Ukraine of Nazis, fighting the NATO puppets, ruining Ukraine. Just story after story of Russia's glory and how they would prevail. And at one point, a Russian TV host claimed that a new structure of the world was emerging and the planet was finally going to be rid of Western leadership. They went on to say, most of humanity is with us. The fact that most of humanity was not with them was unknown to most Russians. Propaganda and isolation work. And aside from the chaos in September, when Putin ordered the mobilization of 300,000 reservist soldiers to join the war, causing hundreds of thousands of Russian men to flee to neighboring countries to avoid being drafted, according to sociologists, most Russians have hardly been affected by the war at all. Although Russia has been hit with sanctions, they're surviving relatively well. The economy has outperformed expectations, with record oil revenues after the war sent energy prices soaring, and China stepped in to buy what the West wasn't. The central bank stabilized the plummeting ruble by raising interest rates, and their currency is now stronger against the dollar than it was before the invasion. McDonald's, IKEA, Apple, all the other major Western corporations that left Russia were quickly replaced with Russian versions of the same thing. Starbucks became Stars Coffee overnight, with essentially the exact same menu and logo. Visa and MasterCard services were canceled, but switched to a local banking system, so their existing cards continued to work inside the country, and if you were traveling abroad, which really only the elites could do, you used cash. Flights out of Russia became so expensive that travel was really just for the ultra-rich, but only about a third of Russians have an international passport, so limiting their travel was of little consequence. And the oligarchs continued to oligarch no matter how many of their boats were seized. Now, inflation in Russia spiked nearly 12%. But Putin, because he's a dictator who doesn't have to get things passed through Congress, immediately announced new benefits for families with children and increased both pensions and the minimum wage by 10%. So most people didn't even really notice the inflation change. MacBooks and iPhones are still easily available, and people in Moscow say that restaurants have Japanese fish and Spanish cheese and French wine, and yeah, it might cost a bit more, but there's no shortage. So it's probably not a surprise then, if you're just listening to Russian news and living a regular Russian life, that you might buy into the idea that your country is really just undertaking a relatively special, small military operation to liberate the Ukrainians from evil NATO who wants to ruin or weaken Russia. In fact, the operation apparently has 3/4 of the country's support. So the people are either smart enough to not say they disagree, or the Kremlin's message is working. What's not working is the war. The war has been an absolute tragedy for Ukraine and the Ukrainians. And without the soft, focused Kerry Lake filter, it has actually been a complete disaster for Russia as well. Hundreds of thousands of people have died on both sides, including thousands of innocent Ukrainian civilians. Ukraine's economy has shrunk by 30%, and 40% of its electricity generating capacity has been damaged. 13 million Ukrainians have become refugees or are internally displaced within the country. The material damage to their infrastructure, housing, and industry amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars, and whenever the war is over, reconstruction costs are going to easily exceed $1 trillion. Russia has lost half of its tanks and armored vehicles, its best warship, and at least 200,000 soldiers. But like any good propagandist, the Russian military has only confirmed 6,000 deaths. Perhaps that's because Putin promised a generous compensation to families of enlisted men who were killed in action, about $160,000. So keeping that official death count low really serves his bottom line. By invading Ukraine, Russia has isolated itself more than any other time since the Cold War, and Western nations have band together for their defeat, while also taking the chance that Putin won't use nuclear weapons if they back him into a corner. The thing is, Putin invaded Ukraine with the idea that the whole thing would be over in a few days. Russian leadership planned for a 3-day war, and almost everyone assumed Russia would win immediately. They were bigger, they had more money, and they had a way bigger army. Their plan was to take over Kyiv, re-establish their puppet government, and be done with it. I think this might be one of the places Russia went wrong. They bought their own propaganda. They believed it was a political war, that there weren't really that many Ukrainians who would be willing to put their lives on the line for their country. They truly thought people would be happy to see them, and they would get the country back under Russian control and face very little resistance. And considering the US's reaction, or lack thereof, to their invasion and annexation of Crimea, their constant presence in the Donbass region, and even America's underwhelming reaction to Russia's blatant interference in our 2016 election, I'm sure they thought we weren't going to do anything either. I think they believed NATO was weak, and America was distracted with its own bullshit, much of which they had successfully stirred up themselves. And they could just take over this country and no one would really care. And if Trump had been in power, that would have been the case. But the first thing Joe Biden did when he came into office was to recognize that the crisis between Russia and Ukraine was real and that it was something we needed to be paying attention to. The Biden administration was right that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. They were right to persuade other people of that fact. And they were smart to know that they couldn't handle the problem on their own, that they needed allies on their side. America didn't just say, here's our red line, don't cross it. Russia had already proved that they could cross our red lines in Syria, and we did nothing. The Biden administration knew they couldn't alone fix it. They needed a coalition to come together, and they needed to do the hard work of getting that coalition together. This administration also changed the way they reacted to Russia. This was no longer about how Russia was a failed democratic project or Putin was someone we could really do business with. This was more about actually taking the data as it was and responding to it in real time. It wasn't the idea of what could happen, it was what was actually happening. So Putin invaded thinking no one would really care. The Ukrainians wouldn't care and the world wouldn't care. And in that, he truly missed the mark. As the war began, a lot of the commentary still focused on Russia's advantages, the size of their military, their overwhelming air force and firepower, their incredible navy, their badass non-woke soldiers, their expansive cyber capacity. The general consensus was along the train of Russian thought, that they would rapidly overwhelm and conquer their neighbor, that the strength of the Russian army was reported to be so overwhelming that as the first Russian forces crossed the border, we had experts around the world analyzing which pro-Moscow Ukrainian politician would be leading the new regime. But as Phillips Peyton O'Brien from The Atlantic writes, the first lesson we all learned is that war is rarely easy or straightforward, which is why starting one is almost always the wrong decision. Instead of unleashing a modern-day war machine on Ukraine, in reality, Russia seemed to be relying on antiquated weaponry and command structures. Instead of taking Kyiv in days, Russian forces experienced major system breakdowns, and since then, their problems have only gotten worse. The Russians miscalculated. They miscalculated the will of the Ukrainians to become an independent country with their own identity. They underestimated their passion to fight to remain a democracy. This wasn't just about land to Ukrainians. This was about their homeland. This invasion was an existential threat to their very existence. It was the difference between them continuing as a people with an independent democracy, free to live as they wanted, or ceasing to exist at all. The Russians also underestimated how over them the Ukrainians were, how tired they were of being undermined and undervalued by this bully next door who thought he owned them, how sick they were of having to fight Russians for their own land. Quite frankly, they were mad as hell and they weren't going to take it anymore. And every granny making a Molotov cocktail, or farmer stealing a tank, or young couple fighting side by side on the battlefield showed that resolve and strengthened their national identity and bolstered their refusal to go down without a fight. Russia miscalculated the strength of Ukraine's leader. An ex-actor and comedian, Volodymyr Zelensky, came into power with limited expectations, but he has risen to the occasion the way few others could. This war has made him a hero. His refusal to leave the country, his frontline visits with the troops, his famous line, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." The battle fatigues, the steely gaze, the hoodies that say, "I am Ukrainian." His choice to only speak Ukrainian moving forward has caused a large amount of Ukrainians to stop speaking Russian as well. Statues of Russian leaders have been torn down. Street names have been changed. Russian history is being left out of textbooks. Putin's invasion has helped the Ukrainians solidify their own identity. As one of Zelensky's closest advisors said, no one will ever confuse Ukraine and Russia again. No one will say, "Oh, it's somewhere over there near Russia." Never again. The Russians miscalculated the outrage most of the world would feel watching this injustice and horror unleashed on innocent people. They underestimated that human decency still exists for a good part of the world.
That's right, girl.
Putin is a cynical person, and perhaps he forgot that the rest of the world isn't as cynical as him.
Exactly.
He didn't seem to realize that aiming to wipe out an entire group of people would go beyond politics and borders, that Ukraine would win the hearts and minds across the world, that blue and yellow flags would be everywhere from people's t-shirts to their internet profiles. Foreign fighters arrived in the country to join the front line, and aid workers from around the world risked their lives on Ukrainian battlefields. Russia might have the support from the autocrats of the world, many of who owe their positions of power to Russia, like Belarus, or need Russia as an ally, like Iran, or share Russia's worldview, like China or North Korea. But a good part of the world is behind Ukraine, both for humanitarian reasons and because most of us are smart enough to see the writing on the wall. If we say, hey, if you're bigger and more powerful, you can just take what you want, no one's going to stop you, where does that end? It's a horrifyingly slippery slope that most countries have no desire to be on. With that in mind, Russia also miscalculated the strength of the NATO alliance and the years of foreign policy experience that America.
I'm Ben Mycelis from the Midas Touch Network. I want to show you this video of the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker. In this video, J.B. Pritzker is slamming Ron DeSantis, the MAGA Republican governor of Florida, and Pritzker's pointing out just the truth that large media networks refuse to cover because they like to try to exalt these right-wing demagogues. And Pritzker saying, look, right here in Illinois, our education system is significantly better than what they are doing in Florida. And then when DeSantis tries to defend his policies, he just uses the term woke because, by the way, he doesn't even know what woke means because DeSantis is just doing performative demagoguery. Let's play this clip of J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois. Play the clip.
I think teachers are worthy of investing in, and by the way, we shouldn't be banning books from our libraries. Teachers shouldn't be forced to, toss books away or put them in a drawer. And the truth is that we actually have a much better education system in Illinois than they have in Florida. We're ranked higher than they are. U.S. News and World Report ranks K-12 education in Illinois 6th in the country and number 1 among the largest states in the country. So he's got nothing to brag about when it comes to education. So he moves on and tries to use this word woke to describe everything. He doesn't even know what the word means, and he has no definition of it. It's just anything he doesn't like is wokeism. And all I can tell you is that I don't know what that means, and frankly, what I can say about Illinois is that we're a state that cares about equity. We're a state that cares about our families. We're making the investments that are required so that our youngest children will do better and better. And I'm really excited about the direction of our state, as opposed to a state where they don't make the investments that are necessary to lift up their education system or their healthcare system.
I couldn't agree more with J.B. Pritzker there. And, you think about it. The large media networks, they devote so much attention to DeSantis. It's like the same thing they did with Trump. Rather than call DeSantis out for his horrible policies and the actual impact of what DeSantis is implementing, which is horrible for the state of Florida. I mean, Florida can actually attain so much better. I mean, they're struggling with home insurance, and the ability to rent there is borderline impossible right now. And the education system in Florida is horrific right now. And, one of the bills that they're introducing right now is House Bill 999, which basically reflects DeSantis's policy of leaving all of the faculty hiring to the Board of Trustees, allowing faculty members' tenures to be reviewed at any time, and removing majors or minors at higher education institutions in subjects like critical race theory and gender studies. And it would also prohibit spending on activities that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, and create new general education requirements. Essentially would allow DeSantis to completely gut higher education in Florida. And DeSantis has done the same with all education in Florida, and kindergarten through high school education as well. And he tries to say, well, we're not banning books, it's discretionary if it violates our CRT standards. They just make up words, which they then implement policies behind that actually result in impacts of retaliating against teachers and attacking teachers, and it's intentional and purposeful, and it's an attack on education. One of the things DeSantis also said that he is doing and is implementing is trying to ban all of AP studies, which is very important to high school students who want to gain credits for college and to take important coursework, because he feels intimidated by them or embarrassed by them because of the fact that they had AP African history, African American history, and got into a whole thing with them over that. And he wants to replace it with, say, a Christian form of education, in public schools, mind you, and no longer respecting the separation of church or state. By the way, whatever you want to study outside of public education is fine, but replacing AP studies with that doesn't really comport with what our Constitution says, and it also is like, let's make sure we encourage the best education. Here's another clip, though, of J.B. Pritzker saying, look, we can't take sides we must take sides when it comes to certain issues. And we can't just sit on the sidelines. Sorry, that's what I meant. So we can't sit on these sidelines when it comes to certain issues. And this is an issue that I'm not going to sit on the sidelines for. Here, play this clip.
This is the land of Lincoln. We have a responsibility to that legacy. As Elie Wiesel said, we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. With that in mind, I want to take sides on something that I feel obligated to speak out about, especially given the history of anti-Semitism and discrimination suffered by my ancestors and that persists for so many others today. There is a virulent strain of nationalism plaguing our nation, led by demagogues who are pushing censorship, with a particular attack right now on school board members and library trustees. It's an ideological battle by the right wing, hiding behind a claim that they would protect our children, but whose real intention is to marginalize people and ideas they don't like. This has been done in the past, and it doesn't stop with just snuffing out ideas. This afternoon, I've laid out a budget agenda that does everything possible to invest in the education of our children. Yet it's all meaningless if we become a nation that bans books from school libraries about racism suffered by Roberto Clemente and Hank Aaron, and tells kids that they can't talk about being gay.
Yeah.
And that signals to black and brown people and Asian Americans and Jews and Muslims that our authentic stories can't be told. Look, I'm the father of 2 children. I care a great deal about their education. Like every good parent, I want to be involved in what they learn. I'm also a proud American. Our nation has a great history and much to be proud of, and I want my children to learn that history, but I don't want them to be lied to. I want... I want them to learn our true history, warts and all. Illinois' young people shouldn't be kept from learning about the realities of the world. I want them to become critical thinkers, exposed to ideas that they disagree with, proud of what our nation has overcome, and thoughtful about what comes next. Here in Illinois, we don't hide from the truth, we embrace it. That's what makes us strong.
and also when it comes to being fiscally conservative, what I've always said is that, I'm sick and tired of letting MAGA Republicans call themselves fiscal conservatives when they do such damage to our country. It's been the federal level, Democratic administrations that have balanced budgets and have reduced the deficit. It's been Republican administrations that have increased the debt and increased the deficit. Look, 25% of our national debt comes from Donald Trump. That shouldn't be shocking because his entire career he bankrupted everything he touched. And all the times when Donald Trump continued to add to our debt, again, a quarter of our debt is from Donald Trump. That's just facts. The MAGA Republicans continue to raise the debt ceiling. Yet, with President Biden, someone who's cut the deficit, who's reduced our debt, now we have to pay the bills that the arsonist Donald Trump has created. That's what raising the debt ceiling is. It's about paying bills in the past. Now MAGA Republicans want to try to cause America to default on its debt, to default on its full faith and credit. But here's another clip of Pritzker I think he was on Bloomberg, or he was on Bloomberg, saying, look, we balance the budget here in Illinois. Like, we have fiscally responsible policies. Play the clip.
Well, from the very beginning, we knew we had work to do. We were one notch above junk rating when I took office. And then, of course, we had the pandemic hit us. So from the beginning, though, we passed a balanced budget, and every year of my term, we balanced the budget. That didn't happen before. We were running a structural deficit. We're essentially eliminating that deficit. And now, not only have we gotten credit upgrades for the last 2 years, but we're, I hope, headed for even more, even after this S&P raise to A-.
There's this broader failure, though, that's going on in large media networks that we don't fall for here on the Midas Touch Network. And what they do is they exalt the demagogues, and they don't really talk about the great accomplishments of people who are doing good work, right? I guess Democrats, governors who are just doing their jobs and helping the people, well, that's not sexy enough for large media networks to report on. So they report on people like the outrageous policies of DeSantis and Abbott. And look at Ohio, look at DeWine. DeWine ignored the phone calls, refused to take the phone calls from President Biden, who was offering to help Ohio after the train derailment. And DeWine was doing it to help the company who was a big donor of DeWine. He had Abbott in Texas who can't even keep the lights on. Yet the media, when they cover these demagogues, they promote them. They normalize the behavior. Meanwhile, you've got incredible Democratic governors, and I'm only going to list a few here, but I put Pritzker into the category of very strong Democratic governors who are just doing good work for the people. You got Gavin Newsom in California, you got Jared Polis in Colorado, Ned Lamont in Connecticut, you've got Andy Beshear in Kentucky. In Republican Kentucky, you have a Democratic governor who's united the state, who's widely popular for implementing very popular policies that help people, that deliver for people. In Michigan, you got Gretchen Whitmer. Right, just think about it. Do you ever hear the media talk about Gretchen Whitmer? Gretchen Whitmer is an all-star. Yet all the media, and by the way, someone who could be president one day, yet you don't hear the media network talk about her at all. They just talk about DeSantis, this very powerful move by DeSantis. Powerful move? These are fascist moves. These are anti-American moves that he's making. These are racist and hateful moves that he's making. Meanwhile, Gretchen Whitmer is running the state of Michigan, one of the largest states in America, very, very, very successfully, calmly, compassionately, unlike the erratic, emotional behavior of Ron DeSantis. There's a big difference there. And so I want to highlight people like Pritzker and his statements. And I like that Democratic governors are starting to call out this performative MAGA Republican governor incompetence and fascism. I hope we see more of them. We'll certainly highlight them here on the Midas Touch Network. Now do me a favor if you can. Hit the subscribe button We're on our way to 1 million subscribers thanks to your support. In March, we're going to try to hit 1 million subscribers. We're calling it the March to 1 million. So hit
I'm just
subscribe
gonna go.
wherever you get your
And I'm
audio
about to chill
podcasts,
now.
if you can.
So those are my favorite people to watch. I have plenty more that you can watch and see exactly what they do in the Congress and the commentary, real commentary, not fake news like Fox, that already been they already got busted for fucking lying to their viewers. So this is why I always say you need to be very careful who you watch, you know, and do your own research because politicians they fucking lie all the time on both sides. But what's happening now is that this MAGA group of fucking Republicans now, they are like really they're getting very very vicious and they don't care. Now they just saying that shit out loud. You know, they just cheating and they're lying and they don't care if you know about it or not. So they're people that they have that vote for them. Evidently, I mean, because I cannot believe that anybody is that fucking stupid unless you are a racist, fascist, autocrat, want to be into some kind of dictatorship. So, you know, that's the shit that happens. And, you know, we're going to fight against that. We have to. All you got to do is go and vote. Vote these assholes out. Let them know we hear you, we hear your lies and your bullshit. Thank you all for coming in. I'm going to end on this note. And I'm going to come back and we're going to listen to something. Maybe I'll play some music. Thank you for coming.